Well, I think we're ready to start. We try to start on time, on military time, and we've got a big crowd this evening for what promises to be one of our very best lectures. So welcome. For those of you who haven't been here, welcome to the Audie Murphy American Cotton Museum in the 6th lecture of the World War II History Roundtable, Audie Murphy Chapter, since its founding in the spring of 2023. My name is Ron Robinson, and for those who are first-time attendees, I have the privilege of serving as chairman of the Roundtable Board. Now, before we get started, we have a very special introduction. For with us tonight is a World War II veteran, 100 years old, and one of our board members, Graham Sweeney, is hosting him this evening. And Graham is going to introduce him and say a few words about him. And then, after the program is over, Mr. McNatt will stay around for any of you who might want to talk to him about his experiences in World War II. So Graham, sure. If I can turn this microphone on, I'm going to give it to you, and you introduce Mr. McNatt.
I'd be glad to. I had the pleasure of picking him up. I don't think he needs an introduction. I'm watching him say hello to everybody. I think he knows the whole room. He's actually 100 years and 3 months old, if you will, please. And he let me know that he had to come in early from working on the farm repairing the fence for the cattle. Asked him what his agenda was yesterday. He said the same thing, repairing the fence out in Wagner. His hero is Monty Stratton, served in World War II. Let's welcome Mr. McNatt. Can you stand, sir?
I can't get up if I've got 2 arms on each side.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. We're trying to be high-tech around here, and sometimes most of the time it works. Okay, the Roundtable was founded, for those, again, most of what I'm going to say is to those who haven't been here before. The Roundtable was founded in an effort to memorialize the efforts and sacrifices of those men and women who served in World War II and successfully defeated the forces of tyranny. Our motto, printed in your program, says it all. They fought to save our nation's freedom. The glory is theirs. The duty to tell their story is ours. And that's what the Roundtable is all about. Our charter goal sponsor for tonight's lecture is Lou King. Lou was a longtime volunteer at the museum and served on the board of the museum for many years. Our charter goal sponsors support the direct costs of bringing our speakers to Greenville. If you or your company or organization has an interest in becoming a charter gold sponsor, please see me after tonight's program. By the way, if you become a charter member, charter member tonight, all books in the bookstore will be 20% off, plus the museum will extend a complimentary 1-year membership to you. Should you wish to make a cash donation to the Roundtable for tonight's lecture, you may do so at the cash register or at the donation box where you registered. The opportunity of becoming a founding charter member or founding charter gold sponsor will conclude at the end of this month. Individual and corporate names of both classifications will be displayed on a plaque to be placed in the lobby of the museum. After November 1, Roundtable will still have annual memberships and annual gold sponsors, but they will not be charter sponsors. Our special thanks to the Audie Murphy American Cotton Museum for hosting our Roundtable lecture. Staff members Kristen Still and Susan Lanning have been invaluable with their support. Other Roundtable volunteers this evening include Preston Norris, and David King, who you met when you came in the back of the room and signed in. Matt Middleton, Also is our videographer. Most of you can't see him over here on your right. And this program will be up on YouTube within a week or so of tonight. At the conclusion of tonight's lecture, the screen behind me will be lifted, and new attendees are welcome to tour the Audie Murphy portion of the museum. Following Steve Moore's program, he will be happy to answer any of your questions. A microphone will be brought to you by Susan Lanning. Please wait till she brings it to you before asking the question, so the audio will be captured on the video for YouTube. Steve will also pose for pictures behind the podium. After his program, he will autograph books, and he has brought a broad selection of the many books he has written. And some of them he has at discount prices. The book he's going to be talking about tonight is also available for you to purchase, and he'll personally autograph for you. And it will make a great gift to others who are interested in World War II history and are not here tonight. The Programs Committee of the Roundtable is pleased to announce a series of 5 lectures for 2025. That program was at your seat in the printed program. It's there on the page. And we have several full-page sheets that I've handed out to many of you. Current plans call for all of them to be at the museum except the special Audie Days lecture, which will be held at the Civic Center. Of special note is the Seth Patton and John Parshall lectures. Both are internationally acclaimed World War II scholars and historians. Patton was the official historian for the National World War II Museum in New Orleans for 15 years and hosts a weekly podcast entitled The Unauthorized History of the Pacific War. Parshall is recognized as the preeminent historian on the Battle of Midway and Japanese naval strategy in the Pacific. He annually leads historical tours to the Pacific battlefields. By the way, 2025 is the 80th anniversary of the end of the war and Audie Murphy's 100th birthday. The theme for the 2025 lecture series is 1945, Peace at Last, the events that made it happen. So we hope all of you here tonight will join us next January for the first of those 5 lectures. And now for the introduction of our speaker, I would like to introduce the chairman of the Programs Committee of the Roundtable, Skip Steele. Skip resides in Paris, Texas, graduated from East Texas State University. Did you get that? It's a kind of a private joke, Steve. The university had several names, and they're going through another name change. Anyway, and he has written over 20 books on Texas and World War II history. His biography of James Richardson, the admiral preceding husband Kimmel, as commander of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, is read by anyone who wishes to study that era. You may find many more of his books up on Kindle. Now, when we get to Q&A, before I introduce Skip, one of the questions I want you to ask our speaker tonight, Stephen Moore, is he's written these 20-some books, and he also has another job. So your question is going to be to him, so I'm getting him prepared to answer it. Where do you work, and when do you have time to write 20 books and still be a young guy less than 40 years old? And he made it. So with that, would you welcome Skip Steele for his introduction? Thank you.
That's real good. I met Stephen when he was 15 years old. We were on a program with Jim Hornfisher. I know that's a strange name, but it was a great name in the history world when we were with him in Fredericksburg on a panel about World War II and pre-Pearl Harbor also. But the thing that, every once in a while you meet somebody twice in life and you get to ask a lot more questions, but it always intrigues me when someone says they're a sixth-generation Texan. You realize how hard that is to me? So I checked it all out. And I'll guarantee you, on these two charts, you can prove it, and you can have them.
Thank you, sir.
His great-grandfather was William Turner Sadler, and listen to this, this is how close we are. My great-grandfather came to Texas in 1816 at Pecan Point, and his great-grandfather came to Texas in 1822 to check it out and left. Not a bad idea at that time. We were still part of Arkansas anyway. But anyway, these two men, George Wright and W.T. Sadler, both lost children after San Jacinto. One went to Lamar County, one went to Anderson County. They were both in the 9th Texas Republic of Texas Congress. And then after the Texas was annexed by the United States, his great-great-grandfather served in the 1st and 2nd House of the legislature. And then they both went off and fought Indians, and one of them went to the Secession Convention, and the other one served in the Civil War. So we're pretty close. But what I want to say mostly is that it is so tough to write a good history book in the military world without interviewing a whole lot of people, and he did it. And I'd like to just tell you about a couple of men that were from Northeast Texas that were serving under Patton, and it'll give you a little bit of the attitude. Milo Clovis Hume died in Cunningham, Texas at the age of 86. That's in Lamar County. It's covered up by solar panels now. He was born in 1916, graduated from high school and entered the U.S. Army in 1942. He was captured by the Germans at El Qatar and remained in North Africa, in Tunisia, and remained a prisoner of war for over 738 days. For serving in the campaigns in Central Europe as a farmer for the Germans, he also served in French Morocco and Tunisia, and he received 3 Bronze Service Stars, Good Conduct Medal, and was entitled to wear a European, African, Middle Eastern Theater campaign ribbon. And then he did not know he worked for Patton when he got arrested or taken as a POW and taken all the way back to Germany, but he also was freed by Patton's men later on in Germany. The other guy that Stephen writes about is Bill Harper from Mount Pleasant. He was born in 1920 in the Chapel Hill community of Titus County, and proudly served in the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion during World War II, with the battalion being attached to the 1st and 3rd Infantry Divisions run by Patton, partially run by Patton. And he made it to North Africa, Salerno and Anzio, and then into France when we invaded from the southern end. He was wounded at Nuremberg and got a Silver Star and other combat medals. This is just a good example of 2 of the many men that Steve interviewed and is going to tell us about now. Stephen L. Moore.
All right. Thank you much.
Give me just 1 second to get this going. I appreciate it, Ron and Skip, and I wish I remember being 40, but I'll take that as a compliment. Get my little notes up here. Appreciate everyone being out tonight. Like you said, we'll open this up to question and answers. Yet I don't want to talk for an hour and keep you bored to death, so I'll talk for a while. I'll go into some of the story of El Guitar, North Africa, and Patton, then open it up for questions, be it this campaign or other World War II topics I've covered, or just writing history in general. Love to speak to folks and answer questions, but I can work our little deal there. All right, there's the man, George Smith Patton Jr. He believed in leading from the front. That was one of his mottos. That's one thing that he stood by, and men respected him for, whether they respected him for other things or not. His command style in the U.S. Army during World War II was inspiring to some, vulgar to others, and controversial at best. His father was a Confederate colonel who was mortally wounded during the Civil War. As a child, George Patton Jr. never seriously considered anything other than a military career. Patton avidly devoured military history, studying the careers of early leaders such as Hannibal, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte. Like them, Patton was a colorful character, even early in his military life after graduating from West Point. He was skilled at fencing and in running, and competed in the pentathlon in the 1912 Olympic Games. Later, while serving on Border Patrol duty, Patton had pursued Pancho Villa through Mexico in 1916, shooting 3 of Villa's men with his Colt revolvers and earning himself the nickname Bandit Killer. During the First World War, Patton had earned the Distinguished Service Cross during an attack against German machine guns. Following World War I, he worked closely with Dwight Eisenhower in shaping the way tanks should be used as an independent fighting force rather than as infantry support vehicles. Both Ike and Patton wrote articles for the Army, and at the time, they were not taken well. The Army didn't see it that way, but these guys had different visions of what armored warfare could be. Well, Patton and Ike's paths would, of course, cross again during World War II, where the man that some called Old Blood and Guts would be elevated into his first command role, which we'll talk about here in a second. During training, Patton wanted his officers to know what they should expect in battle. And he was harsh. He was a tough guy. He often said to them, "You're going to be up to your neck in blood and guts," trying to paint reality for them. His GIs, many of them often pushed to the breaking point, would swear that any victory Patton ever won was going to be from our blood and his guts. So even early on, there was a little bit of distaste for this man and how forward he was. But during the build-up to World War II, Patton's style was recognized by many, including the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and many others in some of the war games that were held in the southern United States. Patton is by far the best tank man in the Army, Marshall said. Patton was also one who knew how to handle Patton, a man known to be pretty blunt and profane at times. Patton was recognized by another one of his colleagues during a second round of war games that was held in Louisiana and even went to the edge of the Red River in Texas in 1941. Lieutenant Colonel Omar Bradley said that Patton utilized, quote, "dazzling speed and surprise to run his division against his enemy, and called him one of the most extraordinary fighting generals the Army has ever produced." Now in these games, there's the Red and the Blue Army facing each other, and Patton mechanized his armored division. There were bridges destroyed as part of the war games, and you couldn't cross certain rivers. So he just broke the rules, took it upon himself to go all the way down south toward the coast, cross Louisiana, over the Red River, and up through Texas. He even had to have his men stop at service stations at Texacos to fill up those tanks. But he got to Shreveport and surprised the other army. So his ingenuity was recognized by many, including the press. During 1942, during desert training in California, Patton was interviewed by many newspapermen, including Time magazine, who reported that the general was known to his troops alternatively as Flash Gordon or Old Blood and Guts. So he already had a reputation before he got overseas and started taking command. Let's see, go here. So this is November of 1942. By this time, Patton's a 2-star general, and he's in commands that are going ashore in Morocco during the Allied landings in North Africa, which was known as Operation Torch. So you can see French Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and where some of the campaigns will be fought during the North Africa period. Casablanca fell within days, and Patton was disappointed to not be given command of U.S. Army forces in North Africa. As the he was studying the command of other Allied leaders as they pushed into Tunisia. He became critical of their techniques of operating far in the rear and commanding the troops. Notably, he called out British General Kenneth Anderson, who had his own headquarters 100 miles behind the front lines. Too far by 95 miles, Patton said. So he didn't appreciate that style. Now, in the early part of the campaign here, these are a couple of your key leaders. Now, as events would play out, Patton will get his chance soon enough to employ his own command style. But during early 1943, the U.S. Army II Corps commander was Lieutenant General Lloyd Friedendahl. He kept his own headquarters an equal distance from the front lines as the Allies pushed into Tunisia. Friedendahl often issued confusing orders to his subordinates, to his officers, and allowed his 1st Armored Division to operate in widely scattered groups. Now, Friedendahl's forces faced heavy resistance in the form of German and Italian troops in North Africa. The most famous of his opponents, seen here, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was known as the Desert Fox. Rommel was struggling with his own health issues at the time and with keeping his own Dutch Africa Corps troops properly provisioned. The German and Italian troops of the Panzer Army Africa under Rommel had been routed at El Alamein in Egypt and retreated 1,400 miles westward into Tunisia by January of 1943. Following the Torch landings, Hitler had sent the 5th Panzer Army and other reinforcements to North Africa. Excuse me. Rommel was eager to achieve a victory. He soon found his enemy's weak point, the untested and inexperienced American II Corps. By late January of 1943, the Allies had advanced into Tunisia, reaching the edge of the eastern dorsal mountains. Anderson's British First Army held the northern sector, while the Free French of the 19th Corps held the center, and Friedendahl's U.S. II Corps were at the southern end of the line. German panzer divisions, led by General von Arnim, broke through the Allied lines in Tunisia at Fade Pass on the morning of January 30th. The following day, 17 Sherman tanks rolled forward into a trap and were ripped apart by German 88 millimeter guns. An infantry counterattack followed the following day, but Fade Pass remained in German hands. The French, having suffered 900 men killed or missing or taken prisoner, were furious at the Americans, whose command style and poor tactics had been exposed. Now, General Eisenhower, his own visit to the front lines in early February, alarmed him. General Friedendahl's headquarters was so far from the front lines, and he found the II Corps commander spending most of his time in his own command post, reinforcing it, digging underground bunkers out of concrete. The American troops kind of sneered at this and called Friedendahl's headquarters Speedy Valley, Lloyd's last resort, or Shangri-La, a million miles from nowhere. So Eisenhower pushed forward from there and visited the II Corps troops on the night of February 13th, just hours before a major offensive was unleashed by Rommel and von Arnim. Friedendahl had ignored the advice of his frontline commanders once again, keeping his troops thinly spread out through this area. So the Germans attacked on Valentine's Day, February 14th. And Friedendahl was unable to control the disaster. Panzer divisions moved in between two Allied hilltop positions, killing or capturing 2/3 of the 900 men left there to defend them. Sorry, my sinuses are cracking on me today. Among the Americans captured by the Germans was the 1st Armored Division Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Waters, son-in-law of George Patton. So he's got natural motive right there to want to get some revenge on the Germans. The attack turned into a rout. American troops were forced back 50 miles under attack by Stuka dive bombers. They retreated to Kasserine Pass, which ran through the western dorsal mountains and provided a gateway for the Germans to slice into the Allied rear areas. So Eisenhower sent 2nd Armored Division Commander Major General Ernest Harmon out to Friedendahl to check on things. Harmon found Friedendahl groggy. He had lack of sleep. He seemed broken down by the dismal circumstances, possibly even drunk. And defeated, Friedendahl simply said to Harmon, "The party is yours." He's clearly a broken man. So Harmon took control and reported back to Ike that Friedendahl was, quote, "no damn good." In 10 days of heavy fighting near Kasserine Pass, the Americans lost 183 tanks and 7,000 men, including 300 killed, 3,000 missing, and many prisoners of war. The Germans did manage to get through Kasserine Pass, but the arrival of American reinforcements, combined with problems within the German command, caused the offensive to grind to a halt. So Rommel finally pulled back his tank forces on February 22nd. Although the Allies were really the winner at Kasserine Pass by turning back the Germans, it was viewed by many as a defeat because Friedendahl's 2 Corps had suffered heavily in terms of casualties, tank losses, artillery losses, and much more. Eisenhower would come to regret his choice in Friedendahl as his campaign commander in North Africa, and he sent Brigadier General Omar Bradley into the field to observe for him. Bradley reported back to Ike what Ike already knew. Friedendahl rarely visited the front lines. He issued confusing command choices. He positioned his troops too far apart for mutual support in the event of Axis attacks. Harmon reported back to Ike that during the Kasserine Pass debacle, Friedendahl had lost the confidence of his men. There we go. So on March 4th, Patton is notified that he's going to take over 2 Corps. He's a 2-star major general at that point, and he wrote in his diary, "Well, it is taking over rather a mess, but I will make a go of it." 2 days later, on March 6, 1943, Patton reached the 2 Corps headquarters to officially relieve Friedendahl of his command of 88,000 men. The man who arrived there at the 2 Corps headquarters was burning with passion. He wanted to achieve payback, not only for the Army's poor showing in 2 defeats or semi-defeats there, including Kasserine Pass, but also for the Germans capturing his own son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Waters, just weeks prior. So Patton arrives on the scene at 2 Corps headquarters like a typhoon, and they'd never seen anything like it at that point. He immediately disrupted the casual state of affairs that existed there at the Army's high command. He noted that officers and men appeared sloppy in their attire. They lacked discipline. They didn't salute. He took breakfast at 7 a.m., 0700 on the second day at headquarters. And he found that Friedendahl's command staff casually took their breakfast around 0900. So Friedendahl ordered the mess hall commanders, "It'll be closed at 0730 from this day forward," and he announced, "Tomorrow, people will be on time." So he started with the officers and worked his way down. He demanded that his officers and his men be properly uniformed, properly dressed, even in this desert warfare out there. This meant that every man old enough to shave had to have a clean face. Officers had to wear their neckties. Leggings had to be worn. Helmets had to be worn instead of caps, even in the heat. And he handed out fines to anybody out of uniform and tossed others into the brig to make his point. One officer remembered Patton shouting that anyone wearing a wool knit cap without a steel helmet will be shot. So he made his point pretty quick, immediately upon arriving there in March. A tough new era had begun for the American II Corps. Old Blood and Guts believed in being seen at the front lines, unlike his predecessor. He wore a pair of ivory-handled Colt revolvers on his hips. It went back to his time, serving in the cavalry. On his jacket, his steel helmet, and on his command vehicles for everybody to see, he boldly sported those general stars. He was not moving about incognito. So a week later, Patton was promoted to lieutenant general, and he was quite pleased. As a boy, he once carried around a wooden sword when he was playing, and he declared himself George S. Patton, Jr., Lieutenant General. In his diary on March 12, Patton wrote that as a boy, he did not know that there were full generals. And he wrote, "Now I want, and I will get 4 stars." So he was determined there. All right, so there they are during the campaign. This is March of 1943 in Tunisia. So as you can imagine, fresh nicknames sprung up for Patton almost overnight throughout the troops. Those he visited on the front line as he prepared for the new offensive had nicknames they would say behind his back, like Necktie Patton or Gorgeous George, and things a little worse than that from others, but never to his face. No one dared speak an ill word to Patton's face. He was a new 3-star, and he made his presence known. He was loud, he was profane, but he had this high-pitched, squeaky little voice that could almost be humorous, as he's railing out his orders, but you didn't dare snicker in front of him. During one of his inspections of the 1st Infantry and 1st Armored Headquarters, he was critical of Major General Terry Allen. His men had dug all these slit trenches around their command area to protect themselves against the Luftwaffe, bombing attacks. Patton considered this to be cowardly. So he goes over to General Allen and he says, "Terry, which one of those is yours?" Allen pointed out his slit trench over there. Patton proceeded to walk over, unzip his pants, and urinate into that trench. He sneered at his junior officer and says, "Now go ahead and try to use that." His technique of calling out and even humiliating some of his senior officers created hatred among some of the men, as you might imagine. But most of them would later admit that they needed to be whipped into shape, at the point where they were in March of 1943. And this was a man that could do it. Now, in telling this story, I'm not just a Patton historian. I don't proclaim to know every last detail of Patton, but I studied him to a point, a little bit of his background, certainly during his North Africa campaign. But to me, to write history, World War II in particular, I like to talk to the men that were there. I like to talk to the veterans. So I sampled some different people from this campaign, from different walks of life. These are a couple of the guys here from Darby's Rangers. Now, this was a famous group that just got its start over there in 1942. One of my characters is Second Lieutenant Les Ness, that you see there. He was a decorated veteran of Darby's Rangers, or the 1st Ranger Battalion, as they were formerly known. Now, this elite group of men originally numbered only about 500, and they were handpicked from different parts of the service in the Army. They all had to go through rigorous training and exams and physical tests to make the cut. And they had to be just top physical specimens. Now, during the early weeding out process, Les Ness here didn't make the cut. He was cut in 1942. But fortunately for him, his brother, Mike Ness, remedied that situation by typing Lester's name and serial number onto one of the company rolls. In the confusion during this quick buildup of Darby's Rangers companies, that sleight of hand was never discovered. Or if it was, they decided Ness was good enough to keep. Now, Sergeant Les Ness quickly proved his worthiness. By February of 1943, he was one of only 22 Rangers that had participated in 2 great raids, one at Dieppe and one at Senade Station. He was also one of only 4 Rangers who had received battlefield commissioners to become an officer by that point. So from being cut to becoming an officer in a matter of months, tells you a little bit about his character and what a soldier he was. But Ness was only weeks into his commission as a new 2nd lieutenant when he had a tense confrontation with General Patton. Ness and a bunch of his Rangers were out on special detail in preparation for a raid they were going to do, gathering materials and supplies with a truck, kind of casually dressed because they'd been given the okay to do so. Well, that doesn't fly with Patton, of course. He comes upon them, finds them without the steel helmets, without proper attire, has a fit, and marches them back to his headquarters. And along the way, there was little disrespect shown to Patton and some of his staff, so it became quite heated. I'll talk about that in the book. Now, I was fortunate to track down the last surviving member of the original Darby's Rangers, a man named Lester Cook. This was in 2022. He passed away, so I talked to him in 2019, early 2020. He was among the original ones to make the cut, and he told me that Patton fined them $25 for being improperly dressed and being disrespectful at a time when Mr. Cook was only making $21 a month, more than a month's salary of a fine. But fortunately, Mr. Cook said Patton decided his point had been made a few days later, and he rescinded that order. But these guys would come to earn Patton's respect as achieving some of his early victories. Just days after Lieutenant Ness and these guys had their first encounter with Old Blood and Guts, Cook, Ness, and the rest of Darby's Rangers achieved what was Patton's real first minor victory during this North Africa campaign. On the night of March 20, they slipped across the desert and advanced under cover of darkness to an Axis outpost up in the hills, climbing up and down ravines and rocks, and everything Mr. Cook said had to be taped down. They'd have to jump up and down, make sure nothing clinked. There was no metal that could be heard. So they were very careful. Any wristwatch was turned upside down and taped so it wouldn't have a glow to it. And they achieved success. They slipped up on this Axis outpost and surprised the Italians there. Actually, not as many casualties as you would think. And Darby's men ended up taking hundreds of prisoners just days before the Battle of El Guitar. All right, here's a few other of my characters. As I mentioned, I wanted to have different walks of life, if you will, not just infantry, but also artillery, rangers, to paint a little, vignette of some of what was going on in this campaign. So in addition to the Rangers, I focused on a couple members from the two Corps Division companies. From the infantry, selected Lieutenant Red Phillips, Henry Phillips. He gave his perspective of some of the ground action and some of the hills they assaulted. Reynolds and Phillips, both the guys seen there, were involved in the early fighting and in the days following up the initial El Guitar battle as they moved up into the foothills in Tunisia. Late in the campaign, while assaulting Hill 772, Red Phillips was wounded by a mortar round, and he would later be given the Silver Star for his wounds and for his bravery in action. From the Armored Division, I used men, a lot of them from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. You mentioned the gentleman from East Texas. Another fellow here by the name of Tom Morrison. The 601st would become embroiled in some of the heaviest action at El Guitar. Morrison here was a 75 millimeter gunner on an M3 half-track. This is one of his sketches of what those look like. After the war, Morrison became a skilled illustrator, and he created a lot of sketches from the North Africa campaign, such as this one, which took place in Tunisia just a couple of weeks before El Guitar. Now, these half-tracks were built on a rear half-track chassis with regular wheels on the front for steering, which made them very mobile. On level ground, an M3 could do about 45 miles an hour, much faster than even the lightest and fastest German tanks could move. Problem was, they were lightly armored, and as our friend from East Texas mentioned, they earned themselves the name Purple Heart Boxes, the guys that rode these gun motor carriages, because they could only ward off about 30 caliber bullets at 250 yards. So imagine what a big German round's going to do at 500 yards or closer. True to that reference, Morris would earn his own Purple Heart just weeks after that sketch that you saw there that he did in February. He was wounded by the explosion of a mortar shell, but he would recover and continue to serve in Europe. Here's a campaign map. I'll let you look at that for a second to get perspective of where we are and where some of the battles take place. You can see Darby's Rangers moving in on March 20th, taking over one of the hills. Patton's first major ground offensive started on March 23rd, what became known as the Battle of El Guitar. Field Marshal Rommel had actually departed the scene for Germany by this time, which Patton did not know, leaving von Arnim in charge of the Africa Corps. Early that morning on the 23rd, von Arnim's 10th Panzer Division rolls forward with about 50 tanks through the eastern dorsals into the pass at El Guitar Valley. Now, the Germans overran the frontline Allied positions, and they were covered by fire from their big 88 millimeter guns back in the hills. But the Panzers soon encountered a minefield which slowed down their advance. They were greeted by heavy U.S. artillery fire, but those smaller and lightly armored half-tracks that Morrison and these guys were using from the 601st Battalion did a lot of damage, moving quick and getting in and out of there. But in the process of so doing, the 601st suffered 27 out of 37 tank destroyers hit on March 23rd. But they were credited with disabling as many as 36 German tanks in the process. And for their part in helping to hold the ground at El Guitar, the 601st would later be decorated with the Presidential Unit Citation for, quote, outstanding performance in combat. So the little boys got in there with, without the big tanks to support them and did a lot of damage, but they suffered a lot of casualty in the process. During this preliminary fighting at El Guitar, General Patton was notably present on the front lines. At one point, Italian artillery shells were raining down close to his staff, forcing some of them to take cover in the foxholes. As his command vehicles moved from point to point, they were strafed at times by German planes, but somehow he managed to escape injury. During the big battle on March 23rd, Patton watched the afternoon tank show from an observation point up on a hill. Old Blood and Guts proved to be much more present as a general than his predecessor, Lloyd Friedendahl, had been, and the troops noted that. Now, the Germans regrouped that afternoon after a several-hour break and some bombing attacks, and made another attempt in late afternoon to take the Allied position. Once again, U.S. artillery was able to break up the assault, cutting down scores of German infantrymen as they tried to advance across the plains. Watching from his hilltop observation point, Patton was heard to mutter, "What a hell of a way to expend good infantrymen." But the 10th Panzer survivors who retreated in large managed to dig into the hills back to the east of the battlefield. So there we have a few scenes from the battle. Some of the gun motor carriages badly wrecked, tracks and wheels blown off. This is a lull in the morning and afternoon battle. Some of the guys from the 601st looking at their maps. So by that evening on March 23rd, Patton's two corps had stood their ground and achieved their first victory there at El Guitar. Those tank destroyer men had fought valiantly, but they suffered heavy, as I mentioned. They'd fired 2,700 rounds of 75 millimeter shells, 33,000 rounds of 50 caliber, 12,000 rounds of 30 caliber, and 3,700 rounds of 45 caliber submachine gun. And that's just from 37 of those little gun motor carriages. So a lot of artillery, a lot of bullets in the air from a small group of guys. And in the end, only 3 of those M3s remained operable by the end of the day from blasted or otherwise disabled. But American artillery and infantry had contributed to the victory, and Patton proudly wrote in his diary that night, "When the smoke cleared away, we found that not a single American soldier had given any ground. The Lord helped us a lot today." Another of the fellows I interviewed was an artilleryman. This is Hubert Edwards. He was part of the 17th Field Artillery. Interviewed him 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, for this book when I was working on it. And he was one of the last artillerymen I could find that was either alive or in any state to speak to anybody. Very sharp gentleman. During the battle, he helped shoot down a German aircraft from the back of his Jeep. And his artillery batteries were heavily involved in the rout of German infantrymen as they surged forward during the afternoon battles. Edwards lived to be nearly 102 years of age, passed away a couple years ago, but he was kind enough to share some of his impressions with me of General Patton. And one in general, Hubert said, most people didn't like Patton, but one thing you had to give him credit for, that sucker was a fighter. So didn't have to like him, but he knew how to lead men, and Hubert and some of his comrades said, we have to respect that to a certain degree. He'd gone back with the Army a couple times where he lived in North Carolina. They'd let him take part in artillery exercises, so he loved it. Even when he was up, close to 100, he'd go out there and watch the tanks roll out. He said they were a little different than, what they had back in his day. But all right, so this is the next day. This is another map here. As we mentioned, during the main offensive on March 23rd, Patton's two corps held off two different German attacks that day, mainly from the 10th Panzer Division, as they tried to overrun the American position there in the Tunisian desert. The combined American artillery, infantry, and armored divisions were able to repulse those attacks, forcing the Germans to fall back and dig in off this way toward Gabes, another town. The Germans had lost 45 tanks that day and suffered hundreds of casualties and POWs. But General Patton was not satisfied with that. He was critical of them losing so many tanks, the American men. And friction soon developed between him and Major General Pinky Ward, who was in charge of the 1st Armored Division. Patton felt that his forces should have pushed forward more aggressively to continue pursuing the Germans. During one evening phone call, Ward bragged how fortunate he'd been in not having lost any officers that day in combat. Damn it, Ward, that's not fortunate, Patton informed him. That's bad for the morale of the enlisted men. I want you to get some officers out front as observers, as far up front as you can, and keep them there until you get some of them killed. Literally told him that. And that was his motivation tool, like it or not. Get out there and be seen. So Ward did just that. He went out in the next 2 days and led his own assault on one of the German positions up in the hills, using tanks and infantrymen. The Germans were deeply dug in, and the Americans were not able to force them out, but they fought valiantly, suffered a lot of men wounded, including General Ward. He was wounded in the face and made it back. And Patton, acknowledged that and decorated him with a Silver Star. Ironically, Patton actually thought that Ward's actions deserved a Distinguished Service Cross, but he downgraded it to a Silver Star because he said it had been necessary for me to order him forward. Bravery or not, so quite a guy. All right, here's a few scenes from the El Guitar battle, Italian and American forces, tanks out there. Now, in the week following the March 23rd battle, there'd be heavy fighting to the south from El Guitar. In order to start a breakout, two Italian strongpoints existed on what they called Hill 369 and Hill 772. These were a couple of the worst ones to take. From the U.S., you had the 1st and the 9th Infantry Divisions and a portion of the 1st Armored Division to lead one of these assaults. Now, this was a slow, costly process. And throughout these days, General Patton was fired up, motivating his leaders to continue moving forward and continue driving. By April 3rd, the 1st Infantry had cleared Hill 369, but it took several more days to flush the Italians and Germans from Hill 772. Patton became angry during this time by the amount of punishment the German Air Force was raining down on his troops, bombing them and strafing them. During one such air attack, one of his beloved friends, one of his staff members, Dick Jensen, was killed by a bomb blast. That set Patton off, among just his troops being wounded, but one of his close comrades and staff members being killed. So Patton ended up taking out his anger on the British High Command, condemning them for allowing the Germans to operate and rule the skies at will there in North Africa. He told them that their air cover was a joke, pretty much. You know, the Germans can do anything they want. You guys are busy doing anything else but protecting my troops. And it led to some back and forth exchanges between the British and American high command. And one of the British commanders responded by saying that Patton's reports were exaggerated, and perhaps the American soldiers were not really that battle worthy anyway. Didn't go over too well with Patton. Finally, 2 days later, after this makes it to Ike and other high command, they're trying to sort this out, cool the tensions, and keep the Allies friendly amongst each other. So a group of the Allied air chiefs, the air bosses, come to Patton's command headquarters to try to sort this out. Let's get past this. As you can imagine, Patton gets heated and he's shouting at these officers and carrying on. Well, lo and behold, in the midst of him shouting at the air commanders, you start hearing the whine of engines, the Focke-Wulf fighter engines coming in from low altitude. Here comes the German fighters and the bombers to begin strafing and bombing Patton's headquarters in the midst of this meeting. Most of those officers took cover on the floor, but Patton grabbed up his Colt revolvers and raced outside and was firing them at the departing German planes for whatever it was worth, just because of his anger. He came back into the meeting center there, just his blood boiling, he's fuming, and one of the British air bosses kind of looks up and says, "How did you manage to arrange such a perfect demonstration of our poor Allied fighter cover?" Patton's reply was, "I'll be damned if I know, but if I could find those SOBs who flew those planes, I'd mail each one of them a medal." So his point was made. Air support got a little stronger in the days that followed, in the last weeks of the campaign. They made their amends, they buried their hatchets, and Patton knew from that point on his troops would have the benefit of stronger air support. But it was not until the second week of April 1943 that the Axis defense broke down that line in Tunisia. American forces had pushed down the El Gabez road to confront the lead elements of the German army. The Axis forces were made to retreat, and Tunis soon fell to the Allies. Those are Axis POWs there. In a mere 5 weeks of command, Patton had managed to turn the tide. By the time he handed command of 2 Corps over to General Omar Bradley in mid-April, so that Patton could return to begin planning for the Sicily invasion, 2 Corps was in the process of carrying out the final push against the last Axis strongholds in the hills. By May 9th, Bradley's troops had forced Tunisia to be secured, and his troops were rounding up hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners like you see there. This is a scene from May of 1943 at one of those POW camps. So, victory secured. And at this point, Bradley sent a cable to General Eisenhower on May 9th saying, "Mission accomplished." The mopping up conditions would take more days, of course, and during that time, the Allies captured German generals von Arnim and Hans Kramer, among many others from the Afrika Korps. British General Alexander then triumphantly declared back to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, "We are masters of the North African shores." So after assuming command of the 2 Corps in early March, George Patton had achieved payback for the capture of his son-in-law, the death of his own close friend, and retribution for the losses the Americans had suffered in January and February of 1943, including Kasserine Pass. He'd whipped an ill-prepared army into shape in just a matter of weeks, and his steering influence built character into these men, many of whom he would see in Sicily and campaigns ahead. As we moved to Sicily and Italy and France and all the other campaigns, this was the proving grounds in North Africa for a lot of the army. Desert warfare was something completely new to a lot of these guys. Now, although a lot of Patton's characteristics and his styles would not be acceptable in today's military or business world, the underlying traits of his strong techniques and his training were evident. He was not afraid to get his own hands dirty. He inspired his men to believe that success was possible with the right mindset. He believed in proper frontline tactical training and that leaders should lead from the front, and he did so. Despite these harsh mannerisms, there were certain nuggets of wisdom to be mined from the veins of old blood and guts during this first campaign, one that would be dubbed Patton's first victory. So that was how he got his start, his first small period of time, small campaign, but powerful. So a lot of this I talk about in Patton's Payback. I promised I won't talk forever on that since I'm fighting a sinus issue, but love to take some questions on North Africa, on Patton, history in general. Open the floor. I know we've got a mic out here, I believe, for anybody that has a question.
In the
See what-
movie, Pat,
Go ahead.
what things in there are not true?
Oh, with any movie, there's a little bit of, historical fiction mixed in, but I think by far the North Africa campaign part was pretty good. I enjoyed that. And like I said, his latter life, I didn't study extensively, just a little bit on his other campaigns, but men that have watched it thought it was pretty good. Not with anything else, Battle of Midway, Texas Revolution or whatever. I can pick 100 holes in the Texas Revolution movies, but it was decent for the time that it was created. I think we had one more back behind you. Our video man had a question, right?
I think he asked the same question I was gonna ask. Did the movie get it right?
All right. Yeah, if you ever see a video, there's a few out there on the internet of his high-pitched, squeaky little voice. It just doesn't seem to go with the man that just all fire and blood and guts and brimstone. But they did respect him. But again, the Rangers and some of those other guys hated his guts at the time. Yes, sir.
Skipping from North Africa to the invasion of Europe, my dad was former mayor of Greenville, but he was in the 7th Armored Division and part of Patton's 3rd Army
Okay.
for the invasion of Europe. And he talks about Patton as his leader, and he said that Patton loved to meet with the reconnaissance people. And my dad was a company commander of the 87th Recon, which was a light tank, he was a former cavalryman
Okay.
in the Texas cavalry. Anyway, and he was a light tank commander, and because Patton loved to talk with his reconnaissance people, my dad met twice with Patton.
Wow.
And for his update on what he sees and what he's doing. And he said, Dad said that he would often go through an intersection, and out in the middle of the intersection, directing traffic, was Patton himself. And he said he liked to be involved. He didn't particularly like to relegate to somebody else. If he can do it himself, he'd do it. But he said he enjoyed very much working under him. And
So your dad had a good impression of Patton?
yeah. Dad was wounded and lost his arm in Holland, and so he was exited out.
Okay.
But he said he had a good close encounter.
Good to hear. Yeah, he was a character. He would expect people to do whatever he asked without questions. He had one staffer back at an army base. He was demanding they speed through the base. The guy wouldn't do it. He said, "You either pull over, I'll do it myself, or you start speeding." Yes, sir. So he was different. He didn't care about the rules. He cared about achieving what he wanted to achieve. We've heard some of the incidents later in the war of slapping, a shell-shocked soldier in the hospital and got himself in a lot of trouble, but he did come back and lead other commands later. he said he had dreams of being buried beneath both his friends and foes, and of course, late in the war, he, perishes over there, and they have a, full military service with people from numerous countries there to pay their respects. So he got that wish. Yes, sir.
Patton's background being in cavalry, how much influence do you think that had on his tactics he used with tanks?
I think a fair amount. He and Ike shared quarters at a base, adjoining family quarters. He was friends with Eisenhower's family, the wives and all that. And they spent a lot of time drinking and talking tactics and writing some of those controversial articles for the Army journals of how to use tanks, not as support for an infantry or the third leg of a duck, as he said, but as a different approach, very offensive. They would do crazy stuff. Ike and Patton, go out there and get drunk and get a machine gun and see how long they could fire it before the barrel melted, and bet each other on crazy stuff. So he wasn't afraid to break the rules. He wasn't afraid of, like in the war games, going all the way down south, circling around and doing a maneuver that was not asked to be done. So he thought things out in a different way.
Can you explain anything on the 3,000 men that you, I guess it was men, 3,000 that were missing, you mentioned?
I'm trying to think, on the Americans or, early on.
Early on you said there were 3,000 missing. And,
That-
and I heard, did they get found or why they were missing?
That was just the initial reports. Obviously, most of those guys would turn out to be prisoners of war, taken to German camps and shipped back. So a lot of POWs were presumed lost or missing at first, but then, we find out later what happened to them. And we captured hundreds of thousands of Germans and Italians, but Patton's son, or son-in-law, he was a prisoner for a couple of years, so a lot of Americans captured there. A lot of artillerymen, as they were overrun by the Germans, if they weren't killed, they surrendered, stripped naked, forced to walk through the desert, humiliated, cold at night, hot in the daytime, and finally put into a prisoner of war camp where things were better, if you want to call it that, than walking around with no clothes in the desert, walking on rocks and cactus. So it was tough for our servicemen that were prisoners of war, North Africa or wherever it may have happened, but being a POW in the desert certainly was no fun from some of the accounts I've read.
Okay, you've discussed about Patton's son-in-law being captured, and at some point he was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany around Heidelberg, if I'm not mistaken. Could you discuss the raid that Patton came up with to send a task force to free his son-in-law, and it went downhill from there?
It did, yeah. I don't recall the exact details of that. I know that there was some criticism of that, but Waters was recovered, as I recall from that. He made it back, but you may recall more on that than I do. I studied more just that North Africa window and not as much on that, but I did read some of that. And Patton, he took some abuse or some criticism, not only for mistreatment of soldiers, his profanity, but, raids like that out of the ordinary that benefited his own family, his own son-in-law. So certainly he caught some heat over that.
We actually had, he's since passed away, but we did have a soldier, a veteran from here that was a POW prisoner in that camp when that happened.
Wow.
Yeah, very
Love to have spoken with him. I've interviewed a number of POWs, a lot of them held in Japanese camps from the Pacific War, more so than these guys, but the experience is rough no matter what, wherever you were held.
Yeah.
Hello. So I know the North Africa campaign has a lot of myths surrounding it, especially with large figures like Rommel and Patton and characters like that. I was curious with the historiography, like in writing Patton's Payback, did you have any problems or roadblocks you ran into in trying to sift through what was real, what information, maybe was not so correct or, obviously fabricated as propaganda? and just your overall approach of how you wrote it and what you went about in trying to write that book.
Sure, and almost with any book like that, you run into controversies or stories that you're not sure if they're true or not. And you try to dig in and find the official papers if they exist. And there's some pretty good battle reports here, but my biggest problem with the Patton's Payback book was the lack of veterans alive at this point just a few years ago. I found a handful. Others that might be still alive were obviously living with family members and just not of the mindset to be able to recall all the events. But you do that. I've had a different book, different story, a submarine story where the guys talked about being on leave at Midway and one of the guys coming in drunk and scuffling with Marines and getting shot and coming back aboard the sub. And the guys at the reunion said, that's all bunk, that didn't happen, that guy makes up all that. So I dug into all the daily reports in the papers and got all the subs papers for every day of that month. And sure enough, one night, this guy comes back with a gunshot wound treated by the pharmacist's mate, taken ashore to be treated. So, you know, you have to decide as many sides of the story as you can. Is it real? Is it a lie? And you hear some crazy stuff at times that you think there's no way. And you get 2 or 3 or 4 other veterans who were there that, oh yeah, it happened, or they have something they can bring back to prove it. So to answer that, you try the best you can, but not having as many men whom I could interview. You know, 20 years ago, you'd have a lot of guys from any particular unit or ship or artillery outfit, but not as many for this.
So when you're not writing, what else do you do?
Oh, I'm a marketing guy. I work in marketing and advertising. I've worked at agencies. I work for an electronics company in Dallas. We actually build metal detectors for military, for security, and the guys that go out and search for coins and treasures and stuff like that. So that part's fun, getting to travel around and look for history.
Cool.
A couple of books have been tied into Texas history and finding artifacts. So, and being a father and a grandpa and all the other good stuff. So.
Cool.
Any others? I have one. All right.
And obviously happy to chat with anybody over here afterwards if you have any other questions.
Thank you for your presentation. You said you've written 22 books on World War II. On those 22, what is your favorite son of those, or favorite child of those creations?
Yeah, the different genres. I've done a fair number of Texas history books. As Skip talked about, my ancestors being in the Rangers and the militia. I've got some favorites there. But from World War II, I'd probably say As Good as Dead. 11 servicemen that survived the Palawan massacre in the Philippines, where the entire POW camp was wiped out by the Japanese. They had to escape being dumped on with aviation fuel, jump over cliffs, go through barbed wire, stabbed, shot on an island full of Japanese and try to survive and swim to their safety. And 11 Americans survived. It was a horrific story, but it's so moving to read that, and it was something not that many people know about, this slaughter of Americans in World War II. But meeting their families, one of them lives here in East Texas. He's deceased now, but his daughters and them live here. That one moved me a lot. Uncommon Valor was a lot with Vietnam Special Forces. I have an uncle-in-law who was a team leader with MACV-SOG. Went to Vegas to the reunions and interviewed more than 100 servicemen for that were Green Berets that couldn't talk about this stuff for 30 years. I kept telling Wilson, we're going to do this one day, and he kind of said, oh, we didn't do that much. And I was like, you got the Bronze Star, you got the Silver Star, you captured prisoners of war, you did something. Well, not that big a deal, but it was when you dig it out. So telling stories like the MACV-SOG guys in Vietnam, or the 11 servicemen that survived the massacre in the Pacific that most people don't know about. Those tend to be my favorite, where you enlighten people, not necessarily to a heartwarming story, but something we shouldn't forget.
I
I look around the room tonight and we're pretty much in a generation that knows what you're talking about.
Right.
Do you have an avenue that you can bring this kind of information that brought our country to where it is today to the younger generation, either through the education system or anywhere? Do you have an avenue to bring this to our younger generation that maybe can appreciate a little bit more about what now we have today?
Great question, and that's part of why I do what I do, because I have a day job that pays the bills. Book writing doesn't pay the bills. It's a hobby that I love, but it's meeting the people I've met over the years, from colonels to generals to a mere private soldier, and what they did that no one knows about. Hopefully, some of these books will live on 20, 30 years from now, and other people will read them. Probably not in paper. There probably won't be a Barnes and Noble. There probably won't be a bookstore. They'll be reading Kindle or something on their cell phone, but at least they're converting them to ebooks now. So we'll see, But in that little way, I guess I'm trying as best I can.
And sometimes I'm amazed by the kids that come through here, for example, by how much sometimes they do know. Like, we had second graders here, a class of second graders here today, and I was shocked by some of the things. It's like they actually knew some of the things on my tour, which at second grade I do not expect that at all. Part of that was the teacher preparing them for coming here, but that they remembered it. Sometimes they'll learn something in class and they don't remember it. So they remembered enough of it that they were able to tell me something. So I'm always very happy when something like that does happen.
Or taking little kids out where I've gone to some 1800s battlefields and dig up some musket balls from the 1800s and just give one to those kids, which they don't have much value, but this is a 150, 170-year-old item, and all of a sudden they light up with this history.
Yes, and when you're talking about the young ones, I don't talk about years so much as I talk about your great-great-great-grandparents' time, because they don't understand years. They don't, they're like, was I there? No, but yeah.
Well, they think we're 150 years old. We're
That's right. The Alpha Chapter of World War II History Roundtables is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They have monthly luncheons. They average 200 to 300 people. And they have an amazing program to address the question you just asked back there. They connect with the history teachers in the high schools as best they can in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And they engage them to invite their outstanding history students in their classes to come to the roundtable meetings. The teacher comes with them, the student comes, make sure that it's a topic appropriate for that student at that age level to hear, and then invite their parents to come also. And they've had amazing success at doing that. We talked about that at the roundtable here, but we're birthing this organization. It's going to take a while for it to start walking and running, but we're hopeful also of building an organization that will include the youth of Northeast Texas as an invitation to come to many of our programs. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you, Susan. Okay. We talk about the book stuff. Okay.
By the way, Admiral Richardson had a high voice too. When he's testifying at the Pearl Harbor investigation, he was followed up by Sumner Wells, who had a beautiful baritone voice, and everything he said. I was real interested in Patton's association with God. He seemed to have a real close feeling that God was on his side.
Yeah, he mentions God a number of times. I read a lot of his diary entries from 1943, but ironically, if you go back, he believed in reincarnation. He thought he came from people like Hannibal or Caesar, or he was descending from famous battle heroes. But, he talked about God. Certainly wasn't much of a reverent man in public, but used the Lord's name in vain and plenty of other things he did. But
When he called in the chaplain and said, I need a prayer. The weather's bad. And he wrote a prayer and took it back to Patton, and he approved of it and said, I want 250,000 cards printed and distributed Which, first time it dawned on me that they had a printing press
Right.
in the division. Too cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry again for sinuses bothering me tonight, but I appreciate you guys being out.
Stephen will be right here to talk to you, take a picture with you, or buy a book. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
This video has been brought to you by Juice. Juice is your community-owned provider for electric internet cable TV and true local programming.